humanitehealth.com, and our topic today is what lies beneath the hidden causes of unhappiness and illness. I'm sure you've probably seen this iceberg picture, and often it's used for consciousness and what is conscious and what is unconscious. And what we're going to be focusing on today is what is potentially in the unconscious or unconscious around happiness and health, and what lies beneath the surface. And do, by the way, if you're watching this live, put any questions in the chat box or on the Facebook Live. So here we have our iceberg, and we have what I call the surface and the deep. And many people are just living up what I call on the surface, and I used to be a surface liver as well. 25 years ago, I didn't know anything or any of the content and the information that I'm sharing today. I really didn't know. I was just living on the surface in life. And then things started to happen, and it forced me to go deep. And this is what happens if we have challenges or life problems turning up in our life, then we're going to have to go deep. And what can happen is people will grow up and they'll think they have what we might call a normal life. And I'm going to share in a minute what that means. And when I work with clients, what we find is often I'll ask them in a session, so how was your childhood? And they'll go, well, you know, it was great. You know, I things at home were okay, things at school were okay. I was having fun, I was happy. And there may have been elements of that, but actually there were other things that were going on beneath at the time, which then get forgotten or buried. But the consequences of those things are not forgotten, even if they're buried. And we live in a universe of cause and effect where actions have consequences. And so whatever happens to us as we're growing up will have consequences later down the line. Whether we like it or not, it's just a fact. So we have our normal life on the surface, but underneath we have actually reality. So what can happen at a deeper level, which we're either not fully aware of or we've buried it and suppressed it, is that we've had unpleasant events and situations and circumstances happen in our life. For example, we may have had traumatic incidents, we may have had accidents, we may have experienced neglect or abuse, we may have felt really lonely, which all leads to suppressing our feelings. We may have felt very, very unsafe and very unsure in our environment. We may have felt afraid and a lot of other emotions such as frustration and sadness and hurt. And all of this went on. And what I find is that the setup for unhappiness in adulthood and illness in adulthood all starts by the age of 7. I'm not saying the symptoms or the unhappiness starts, although in a way the unhappiness does start then, but the setup, the foundation is in the first 7 years of life, without fail, with every single person that I've ever worked with over the last 11 years. It's a repeating theme because it's a fact of how life works. So if you have had any of these sort of experiences in your life, then it is quite possible that later in life you're going to end up with some unseen consequences. So here is an example, and I do have permission to share this example of a real live person and what happened to them in their life. So this lady had a very, very traumatic birth. And by the way, birth trauma is a big, big causal factor of stress and life challenges later in life, because it sets up what's called a limbic imprint, and that limbic imprint is very fearful and traumatic and stressful, and it colors everything from then on until we clear it. And so this person had a very traumatic birth, and then 18 months later her brother was born and he was mentally handicapped. And that meant that her mother could not give her any attention because her mother was completely focused on having to cope with this incredibly difficult baby who was projectile vomiting and just screaming and wailing, and just like, you know, a 24-hour job to look after. So this resulted in this child feeling extremely neglected and very alone, but not realizing actually that it could be different, because this is one of the interesting things, is that whatever we grow up with in our childhood, we experience it as the norm, and we just come to expect that as the norm. But it doesn't mean it's healthy or natural. It's just what's normal for us. It just becomes normal. Anyway, so there was also not a great relationship, even despite the brother situation. There was no bonding between the mother, a lot of disconnection. And because the mother was so stressed and had so many of her own problems, she took her repressed unhappiness out on the daughter, and often humiliated her, punished her, leaving her feeling very, very unsafe and very alone. And this also, she was also given a lot of responsibility. She had to look after her brother sometimes and keep an eye on him and watch over him, which was quite a responsibility for a young child. And she received no emotional support from either parent. In fact, did not once remember being hugged by either of her parents. And as a consequence of her mother being overwhelmed with looking after her brother, she was not allowed to have friends over to play. So she could only see her friends at school, but that was it. And that was, you know, quite stressful. And given a lot of responsibility as she grew up, even by the age of, you know, 10, and this is not uncommon, by the way, but given a lot of responsibility for helping around the house because her mother was in overwhelm. And the consequences of this were emotional suppression. So a lot of emotions, but not knowing how to deal with those emotions. And if you've listened to some of my other webinars, I talk about quantum physics and how energy and emotions are energy. They're a form of energy. Energy cannot be destroyed. That's a law of physics. Energy, once it's generated, cannot be destroyed. It can be transformed, but it can't be destroyed. So if emotional energy is generated inside the body, which it's doing from the moment we're born, if it's not cleared or healed or dissolved, whatever word you like to use, it stays in the body. So, and eventually it leads to severe illness. That's where it leads to. So there was emotional suppression, feeling alone. Her only friend she felt at home was talking to the dog. And then a lot of lack of self-worth, lack of self-confidence, lack of self-belief, lack of self-love, because none of this was being modeled. Because we just soak up what is happening in our environment, which is why if you listen to Dr. Bruce Lipton, who did this amazing research into genetics and what is now called epigenetics, and epi means beyond. So epigenetics is next level beyond genetics, and epigenetics has proven that it is our environment and our response to what happens to us in our environment which turns genes on or off. So we have all genes in our body and they can either express or not. And according to what happens in our environment, our genes will turn on or off. Basically, this little girl created a lot of lack of self-worth, lack of self-confidence, lack of belief in herself. And if we're not loved, then we won't learn how to love ourselves. And that is a big, big issue. Also, when we have this sort of thing happening, then what happens is, as a consequence, is that when we try to seek approval. We try to seek approval and love from other people because we just don't feel good enough inside, because nobody's ever really told us we're good enough. And as a consequence of that, that leads to habits such as overdoing it, pushing ourselves too hard, being a perfectionist, being really hard on ourselves, never feeling good enough. And for this person, one of her ways of trying to comfort herself was comfort eating. And if you look at any addiction, whether it's drinking or eating or drugs and there are many types of addictions, even, you know, shopping, whatever it is, we're trying to get our need met. So as children, in the first 7 years of life, we have what are called emotional needs. And those emotional needs need to be met. And they're things like feeling cherished, feeling valued, feeling acknowledged, feeling recognized. And when I work with people, I take them through what we call an emotional needs audit. And we audit, you know, how much were your emotional needs met as you were growing up. And not only that, by the age of 18 months, we have what are called developmental needs, which are also a set of needs, emotional needs, which need to be met even by the age of 18 months. And they're similar to these emotional needs, you know, feeling loved, feeling cherished, feeling valued, feeling respected. All these needs need to be met. And if they're not met, they lead to us not feeling good enough and creating behaviors such as pushing ourselves, always trying to prove ourselves. It doesn't matter what we do. We're never good enough. We'll never do it well enough. Nothing is ever good enough because we don't feel good enough. And what it comes down to is, I'm not enough. And the consequence of doing all of that is that we get exhausted, and we're definitely not happy because deep inside we don't feel happy and good enough. And so that leads to all sorts of life issues, such as physically, we could say exhaustion, burnout, pain, depression, which is the depressing of emotions, chronic fatigue, ME, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel. I mean, I could name 100 different health conditions, multiple symptoms. And then in our life in general, we'll do things like we'll sabotage our success, we'll have financial stress, we'll lose, and actually the examples I'm giving here are actually from this person, is that this is exactly what happened for them. And they lost their house, they had no money, very dysfunctional relationships, at one point in an abusive relationship, and finally unable to work. So these are the real life consequences of this deeper stuff that is going on, that all gets set up in childhood. So remember, this is all because of the birth trauma, the emotional neglect, the humiliation, which brought shame, the punishment, being physically hit, feeling unsafe, which leads to, you know, over responsibility, and also being given too much responsibility at an early age, which created a lot of fear, and not having support. And as I said, it comes down to I'm not enough, which also brings with it, I don't deserve. And really, it could be, you know, I don't deserve happiness, I don't deserve success, I don't deserve good finances. And if you, by the way, if you have problems with finances, it's all this, I can assure you, because it all comes down to value. If we don't value ourselves, then we will never allow ourselves to have what our head is saying we want, which is, for example, lots of money. But really what it comes down to is, I don't deserve love. I don't deserve love. I don't deserve to be loved. I don't deserve to feel loved. This is what it comes down to. So the consequences of childhood trauma and neglect are huge, and they are ongoing until we deal with this stuff, and we have to. And life will force us to deal with this stuff. So in order to clear this unhappiness and illness, we must clear the emotions, we must clear the stress. All of this is stored in the body. We must clear the trauma. We must change our unconscious, limiting, hidden beliefs. There is work to be done. And the key really to healing is awareness, self-awareness. So we become aware of what we were previously unaware of. We heal, and then we make better choices. We have new choices available to us. So how do we grow this awareness? Well, apart from consciously saying I want to become more aware, what I find is that the biggest stimulus, if you like, to becoming more aware is that we get some form of pain or discomfort. So pain is often the way we are alerted to the deeper unconscious issues that we are not yet consciously aware of. And this pain can be emotional, mental, physical, spiritual, and it's a form of discomfort. So emotionally, we may feel unhappy, depressed, anxious, afraid, sad, lonely, hurt, etc. Mentally, the way it's going to show up is we're going to have negative thoughts. And the interesting thing about the mental side of it is that often we're not even aware that we're doing all of this, by the way. And this is why we have to become aware. But these are the signs and symptoms if we're aware of it. So we may have negative thinking, for example, expecting the worst rather than expecting the best. So we could call that pessimism, worry, overthinking, and these negative beliefs. That's what's going on mentally. Physically, we may have symptoms. We may have a health condition. We may have been diagnosed with a health condition by a doctor, and we may be taking medication. We may have just a niggly pain in the shoulder that won't go away. We may be tired all the time. If we're on medication, then that medication is for something, and therefore there's a sign that something isn't going well inside of us. And we may have had surgery, which is also a sign that, you know, something went wrong inside of us, physically, mentally, emotionally, and they're all connected. You can't have something physically happening in the body without something mentally and emotionally going on at the same time. And it could be spiritual discomfort. For example, if we're not on purpose, or we feel there's no meaning in life, or we feel lost, or we feel disconnected, that is spiritual unhealth. So pain, we have to get aware of this. Well, we're going to be aware of the pain, and that's how our attention is brought to the problem, is the fact that we have pain. And once we're aware of this pain and we've had enough of it, because the amazing thing about the human being is that we're incredibly resilient, and we can put up with pain for a long, long time, and we can put up with and tolerate quite a high level of pain for an ongoing time, and it will just incrementally get worse. And so at some point we get to a point where we go, I no longer want that pain. And we have to get to this point. And we have to get to the point of the pain of change finally outweighs the pain of staying where we are. We have to reach this point. Either we don't want to put up with the unhappiness anymore, or we don't want to put up with the physical symptoms anymore, or we're fed up with our negative thinking because we've grown aware of it enough and are aware that we just don't want to tolerate it anymore. And so we decide, I'm no longer willing to tolerate the pain, and I'm going to change. I'm going to find a solution. But this choice point must be reached, and the choice to make a change must be made. Without this, there is no change. And when we make that decision, then we start seeking answers and solutions. And we will find them. If we search long and hard enough with enough commitment, we will find them. But we are likely to need help. We're going to have to, this is not something we can do by ourselves. I can pretty much assure you of that. You're going to have to find some therapy, some therapists, some workshops, some support. We need expert help. So I'm just going to go through a few options of how I offer this help. You may be aware that I have a YouTube channel, and there is a lot of free videos on YouTube. Lots and lots, and there are different playlists. So you can go into a playlist and you can look for example, for a mental therapy playlist, or a, de-stress playlist, or whatever it is. There's about 6 playlists to make things easier to find. So that is one option. Another option is if you go to my website, kimknighthealth.com, I have blogs, and I sort of tend to go in phases of writing blogs, but there are quite a few blogs there to read through, with lots of really, really helpful, useful information. you can test drive some of my free online programs. So everything I'm talking about so far obviously is free. So for example, one program that you may be interested in is, and it may be renamed shortly after this video, but the 5 levels of healthcare. And what this program is about is it explains the different options that are available to you in healthcare. Because if you imagine that you're walking up a mountain, like a very high mountain, like Mount Everest, and the altitudes change, say, every 10,000, or no, let's say every 1,000 feet, the altitude changes. And we can liken these different altitudes to different levels of consciousness or different world views or different understandings and outlooks on life. And depending on our world view or our outlook on life, which is all the result of our familial conditioning, societal conditioning, plus our personal consciousness, we will find our way to different types of healthcare. Now, I'm not talking different therapies here. I'm talking literally different levels of healthcare. So, for example, level 1 healthcare is the doctor, which is only focusing on the physical. Whereas as we start to move up the levels, and I share 5 different levels in this video series, we start looking at the metaphysical, which is what I'm all about. It's about what is beyond the physical, and that's what metaphysical means. Meta means beyond. So we look at what is the metaphysical cause of the physical symptoms. And that is what I talk about and go through and explain in this 5 levels of healthcare. It's a very interesting series. For example, an introduction to my Freedom from Fatigue summit, where I interviewed 10 different people, 10 experts, natural health experts on chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia recovery. So there's a free taster of that program. So that's some of the examples of some of the free programs that I offer. And then you can always be inspired by success stories of people that I've worked with. And if you go to my website and you click success stories, there's a range of videos and written stories from people. Because one of the things that is really important to know, if anybody who's listening to this video has been told, you know, we don't know what's causing the problem and we don't have a solution, which can create a lot of fear, then I want you to know that there is a solution. There's always a solution. You just have to know where to find it, and you have to go to the right people to find it. And then if you're really wanting to deep dive and fill in the pieces of the puzzle of your situation, then I have what I call my Kiwi Health Detective Breakthrough Session. And in 90 minutes, we definitively identify these events that happened in early childhood. And not just childhood, but in fact the whole of one's life. But they're the core contributing factors to why we are now either unhappy and or unhealthy. Because sickness is a furtherance of unhappiness. So there's always going to be unhappiness if we're unhealthy. It sits underneath the symptoms. And then I have paid programs, paid home study, self-help online programs. And there's a range. So again, you just go to my website and check out. And I am going to be doing some editing of my website in the next few months and making things easier to find. But I'm sure you'll find your way to what you need if you have a look through. And then sometimes I have live workshops. So the date's not quite right here. It may change, but for example, maybe coming to the Gold Coast this year. And then starting in 2 or 3 months, I can't say exactly when, I will be giving lifestyle prescription trainings on root cause diagnosis and teaching people how to do this for themselves. Because I'm all about teaching people to do all of this for themselves so that you become the master of you. That is what excites me. And in the near future, I may, it's not confirmed yet, but I may launch what I call my Secrets to Health membership program, which will have educational webinars and videos, potentially a private Facebook support group, monthly live Q&A webinars, and maybe some guest health experts, and that will be for a very, very low monthly fee. But that means that you have access to me at a much more affordable rate than, say, potentially working one-on-one. So that is what I wanted to cover today, and next time, unless something else becomes more pressing, what I'm going to be going through is the topic of how to survive a nervous breakdown. What is a nervous breakdown really? Because actually it can be quite misunderstood. What are the signs and symptoms of a mental breakdown? The connection between chronic illness, life crisis, and nervous breakdown. The connection between nervous breakdown and what is called spiritual emergency, and how to get through a nervous breakdown or spiritual emergency. And that is what we will be talking about next time. So I will just say thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching you on the next webinar.